Our lecture today is going to be about the Gothic Cathedral, and this is the third in a series of 3 lectures that we have that deal with the Middle Ages or the Dark Ages. Now, in this chapter, we're really going to leave behind those dark, dungeonous churches of the Romanesque era to those that are going to be filled with an incredible amount of light. And that's what the Gothic Age is really about. Now, throughout the churches that we're going to see today, there's going to be some similar characteristics. And I remember when I took this class as a student, I kind of threw my hands up and was bothered that these all kind of looked the same, but that's okay. The idea is we're going to look at all of these characteristics together. Now, the main thing about these cathedrals we're going to be looking at has to deal with their strong vertical emphasis. And these structures are taller because they utilize pointed arches instead of rounded arches. So back in the Roman era, we learned that the Romans invented the arch, and we talked about voussoirs and what the keystone was, and the idea that these arches kind of transmitted all the weight from the building off to the sides, down to the ground, and it gave us a tremendous amount of uninterrupted space in which we could live. Now, we had barrel vaults that can be constructed with arches placed one behind the other. We have, in the upper right-hand corner, we have a groin vault where 2 barrel vaults intersect. And we see that here with the blueprint of what these churches look like. We have the nave, moving from left to right here. We have the transept, going from north to south. And then we have the altar area here, or the apse, and of course the area where the relics would be. So that's what we're going to be looking at of churches of this time. And again, don't forget these are cross-shaped now. And so what arches would do is, again, you can see kind of how the weight would be distributed from the building itself. But with the incorporation of what's going to be called the pointed arch, all of a sudden we can create buildings that are taller than we ever have created before. And the weight goes much more quickly, much more directly to the ground. So the first church we're going to look at is the Abbey Church of SaintDenis. And SaintDenis was founded in the 7th century on the burial place of SaintDenis, who was one of the patron saints of France. And in the 12th century, the Abbot Suger will rebuild portions of this church using innovative structural and decorative features. And here's a quote from Abbot Suger, stating that the dull mind rises to truth through that which is material, and in seeing this light is resurrected from its former submersion. Now, the key, again, to all these structures we're going to look at today is the incredible amount of light that is present. And the Church of SaintDenis has been called the very first modern church, or very first Gothic structure as well. Now, Abbot Suger is an important advisor to King Louis VI and Louis VII. Now, with these churches, look at the amount of light that is present compared to the idea of the Romanesque church, which is very heavy, very dark. Now, these structures are taller than the Egyptian pyramids at Giza. There are 100 million pounds of stone being used to create these, which, as far as the weight equivalent, is that of the Empire State Building. So these are huge architectural projects. And these buildings really look like they defy gravity. They were centers of cultural and social, not to mention spiritual development during the Middle Ages. And I'll show you a few images from the inside of this church. It's just incredibly spectacular. This is the apse area, and you can kind of see where we have kind of this semicircle ambulatory around the outside. We can also see the pointed arches there surrounding the ambulatory. Now you're also going to see coffins in this church, and these are coffins of the French monarchs. Literally every king between the 10th and the 18th centuries is buried here, or at least was buried here. During the French Revolution, many of these tombs were opened and the bodies taken and dumped into large pits, the bones dissolved with lime. Now, also with this church, we have these tympanums, and we had discussed tympanums in the last lecture as these semicircular areas above doorways that would tell stories from the Bible. Another wonderful church of the Gothic age is the Chartres Cathedral, and this is in Chartres, France, and it is just an amazing structure. The abbot of Chartres saw the Gothic construction of the Church of SaintDenis and wanted to incorporate it into his church as well. Now, this church is very important to the Virgin Mary, as they have a lot of her relics here. They have the tunic, which is the garment that she wore at the time of Christ's nativity. In fact, in 1194, a fire destroyed the cathedral, except for the west facade, which you see here, and the eastern crypt. The people thought the tunic had been lost, but 3 days later it was found in the crypt unharmed, and it was considered a miracle. They also thought that the Virgin Mary was telling them to build her an even grander church, which they did. Now, the church occupies an area that was considered to be very, very holy, that it was originally a spot for a Druid temple, and then it became a Roman temple, and now a Christian church. So this is a spot that has been built on continuously throughout history. And what's also exciting is on the western facade, you have those two towers. The one that is furthest off to the left was the first one built, and you can see it's definitely done in the Romanesque era, where the one at the right is taller, more ornate, definitely done during the Gothic. And it's nice to see the juxtaposition between the two of them. Now you'll also see in the very far right-hand side kind of some objects jutting out from the back of the church. And those are flying buttresses. And we'll talk more about those in just a minute. Again, a tremendous amount of windows letting in light, and really here light is the symbol for God. This church is very famous for the rose windows and also the doorways. On the three doors here, which is in reference to the Trinity, the forms of the sculptures around the doorways really become lifelike. And there are symbols of learning around the right doors and symbols of working around the left doors. The tympanum in the middle recounts the second coming of Christ. The tympanum at the left, the ascension of Christ. The tympanum at the right shows Christ and Mary together. Now here are the flying buttresses, and the flying buttresses themselves are extensions of interior arches. That's how they should be defined. They help to support the walls of the structure because a lot of these churches were collapsing under the weight. And of course, just the aesthetic or ornamental value of these really helps define the Gothic age. And here's a little bit better blueprint of what the flying buttresses look like and what they do. Again, it's just a continuation of an interior arch, and they support the walls so that the building itself doesn't collapse. It helps to transport the weight further out to the ground. Now, while the bodies of these figures too become very, very cylindrical, their faces are also now, again, kind of going back to that Greek and Roman, early Roman type of figure that's very, very lifelike. The next church we'll look at is the Amiens Cathedral. Again, a church that uses pointed arches. Along the main facade, we have the Last Judgment. Christ peers down to judge the people entering the church. The relic here is the skull of John the Baptist, the one who baptized Christ. Again, it's an extremely large church. The nave itself is 120 feet or 12 stories high. And this is the largest Gothic church in France. And you can look at the flying buttresses here and how they kind of appear in this spider web-like form. Now, the Amiens Cathedral also is extremely dangerous. There's a lot of work going on there now to help support it. But when you start to look at the pointed arches, and let me bring up a picture here where you can very much see in the lower right-hand corner, we have the cracking, and that is when we know that the pointed arches are beginning to give away. And once one of the arches goes, they all go. And there is even a lot of scientific work where you have lasers that are literally measuring at different levels the space between these pillars, and they do very much bow out in the center of them. So there is a lot of work today being used to decide how can we conserve these churches. Now, the final church we'll look at is the Reims Cathedral, and this is, again, in France. It is the coronation church for the French kings. Again, quite beautiful. In 1233, though, construction was halted due to civil unrest because of the amount of taxes, and that's how these churches were, the building of these churches were being funded. The round windows, very dominant in this church, and it's also exciting when we look on the outside roof line of the church that we have all these awesome gargoyles, and they protect the church, but they're also functional in that they get rid of the filth from the ceiling, from the roof. As it's raining, these would literally be water spouts. It was a building that was also built on the site of another 5th century cathedral, and it was heavily damaged during World War I. Something like 1,000 rounds of ammunition had hit this church. Now, one last image from the Reims Cathedral is extremely important as we go into the next and last chapter of the book. This is of the Annunciation and Visitation. Two different sculptors created those. The one at the left is the Annunciation, and then another sculptor completed the Visitation at the right. So at the left, we have Mary being told she's going to bear the Christ child. At the right, we have both pregnant Mary and pregnant Elizabeth. She will give birth to St. John the Baptist. The difference here, all of a sudden, we get a change. We get not only emotional figures, but we also get more lifelike figures and figures that interact, something that we haven't ever seen before. And that's something that we're definitely going to be discussing in the next chapter, as this is now going to be the dawn of the Renaissance.